We'll hear about it later. It's different in structure from a nucleus. But the point of what I'm telling you is, don't slap a bunch of rules on bacteria because you can't slap rules on them. Now, of course, you're going to be writing multiple choice tests in this class. So, hey, better clarify what we do in that case. You're going to see a lot of lines on my multiple choice test that say, like, most bacteria are much smaller than eukaryotes. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yes. I don't like to use the word all and every a lot on my tests because time after time I'm going to point out to you where all and every don't apply to bacterium because there's very few things that every bacterium has in common. Okay, so prokaryotes can also be broken down into different groups, and we break them into two major groups of prokaryotes. The first one being the bacteria. That name in brackets, eubacteria, nobody calls them that anymore. Nobody's called them that in decades, so I don't even know why I still have that there. It meant true bacteria, but all bacteria are true bacteria. So if you ever run into it in an old resource, well, you'll know that that's referring to bacteria. We just call them bacteria now. They are genetically diverse. Sometimes people think that, oh, well, bacteria must be kind of the same as each other, right? I mean, they're really small. They look the same under a microscope, so they must be genetically related to each other. They're not, and we'll see that in a second. In fact, bacteria are much more genetically diverse than are those other groupings we looked at for eukaryotes. They are also extremely diverse in their metabolic styles. Remember, metabolism refers to all of the chemistry that goes on inside of the cell, how they generate their energy. What was that called? How they generate their energy? Catabolism. And how they build their cell material, that one was called anabolism. And how bacteria do that is wildly different from one bacterium to another. So they have a broad diversity in how they generate their energy and how they use that energy to build cell material. Bacteria include both pathogens and non-pathogens. And of course I point that out to you because everybody thinks bacteria and the first thing they think is, get me some hand sanitizer and let me kill those bacteria on my hands because bacteria make people sick, right? Well, it's true, some bacteria do make people sick, but the vast majority of them do not. Bacteria include both disease-causing, that's what pathogen means, includes disease-causing organisms as well as non-pathogens. The second major group of prokaryotes are the archaea. Once upon a time, they were called the archaebacteria because everybody thought that these two groups of prokaryotes were going to be really closely related to each other, right? So it kind of meant true bacteria and archaic bacteria. But those names are not used anymore because now we know that is not true. The archaea are their own distinct lineage. They are a completely separate group of prokaryotes. They are also, they are genetically and biochemically distinct from bacteria, and we'll see in a second that they are classified in a completely different place on the tree of life from the bacteria. They also have diverse genetics. They are a big and broad group with diverse metabolism. And both of these two groups, the archaea and the bacteria, are much more metabolically diverse than the eukaryotes are. Right? Eukaryotes basically make their life one of two ways. They eat stuff and burn it for energy. That's what we do. All the way down to that's what paramecium does, an animal-like microbe. Or eukaryotes get their energy from the sun, and they fix carbon dioxide to make their cell material. That's what plants and algae do. Eukaryotes are very restricted, but bacteria and archaea, they do all kinds of wonderful things that eukaryotes couldn't even imagine. Another important thing to point out about archaea is that they are never pathogenic. At least as far as we know right now, there is no disease that has ever been conclusively attributed to an archaean, right? Like we know the bacterium that causes tuberculosis, and we know the bacterium that causes syphilis, and so on. But no particular disease has ever been linked to archaea. Although, we're going to hear more about archaea when we learn about the microbiome, and we're going to start to wonder whether or not this is a rule that needs to be crossed out. So the same rule goes with archaea. You don't want to go and slap a bunch of rules on them because they're not going to follow them. Many archaea are famous for living in extreme environments. That's where people have studied them the best. The microbes that live in I don't know, boiling hot springs at 100 degrees Celsius are often archaea. The ones that live in saturated salt brines like the Dead Sea, which is absolutely not dead, by the way, it is teeming with microorganisms. There are many archaea living there in the Dead Sea. So they're famous for living in the extreme environments, but we're also going to learn about them when we learn about the microbiome. So they don't only live in extreme environments, they also live right here in our guts, it turns out. Last category of microorganisms. Some people call these microorganisms, some people don't, but it's a microbiology course, so we better at least talk about them a bit. They're going to come up in their own section later on. That is the category called viruses, and they are completely different from the other two because they are acellular infectious particles. Eukaryotes have the eukaryotic cell structure. It means that they have a nucleus. And prokaryotes have the prokaryotic cell structure. It means that they don't have a nucleus. And viruses are acellular. It means that they don't even have a what? A cell membrane or a cytoplasmic membrane. That defining feature of the cell, they don't have it. They are not cells at all. So that's what we've learned today. I know a lot of people use those words bacteria and viruses interchangeably. You will never ever want to do that ever again, right? Because you know that bacteria are cells, it's a cellular organism, whereas viruses are something completely different, an acellular infectious particle. They are extremely small, even in comparison to the bacteria. We will see lots of pictures of bacteria that were taken with a light microscope. In fact, you'll be looking at bacteria in the lab with a light microscope, but you will never see any pictures of viruses taken with a light microscope. And that's because you can't see them with a light microscope. They're too small. You need an electron microscope if you're going to see viruses. They are called obligate intracellular parasites. What does that mean?
They require to be in a cell.
Yeah. Obligate, first off, means that they must, right? This is something that they must do. Intracellular means to be inside of a cell. Parasite means to take advantage of something, to use it for your own good. And so viruses are inert, that is, they don't do anything when they are outside of a cell. Their sole goal when they're outside of a cell is to get inside of a cell and take over. That's because they cannot reproduce themselves without having a cell to live inside of. They are obligate intracellular parasites. The reason is because they lack independent metabolism. Remember, that was one of those things that was common to all cellular life. All cellular life has a way to do catabolism and anabolism, a metabolic system, but viruses don't have that. They rely on the metabolism of the cell that they are going to infect and take over as an obligate intracellular parasite. They have no ribosomes. Remind me what ribosomes do? Ribosomes make protein, right? And all cells need protein because protein is what does all the work inside of a cell. Well, viruses, they have proteins, but they have no ribosomes, which means that they've got no way to make proteins for themselves. They must take over an existing cell and use the ribosomes that are already there. Because they have no ribosomes, they have no ribosomal RNA. And that's important to us because as we start to look at how we classify microorganisms, we will look and see that ribosomal RNA is today a huge part of that. When we want to see if one organism is closely related to another one or not, largely we have gone to genetic methods, and the gene we look at is the 16S ribosomal RNA gene. That lets us compare all kinds of microorganisms, except for viruses. They don't have ribosomal RNA, so they have no ribosomal RNA gene, and they cannot be classified with other microorganisms. So as we start to look at a tree of life and how different microbes are related to each other, you're never going to see viruses on those trees because viruses defy classification. They don't have this ribosomal RNA that we use to classify other microbes. Yep?
It says no ribosomal RNA. Does it have any other kind of RNA?
It definitely can have other kinds of RNA. We're going to have we have our own section on viruses a little bit later in the course. We're going to find out that just like cells, they have genetic material. But for viruses, they got a lot of diversity. Some viruses use DNA for their genetic material, and some of them store all of their genetic material directly in RNA. So some of them definitely do have RNA, but they don't have ribosomal RNA because they don't have ribosomes. Viruses that infect bacteria are called bacteriophages. Why do I throw that out there? Well, I guess one of the things you want to understand here is that humans, although we spend a lot of time thinking about the viruses of humans, we are not the only organism that's so special that we get infected by viruses, right? Other animals get infected by viruses too. You're hearing about bird flu popping up in Manitoba. And it's not just birds. Plants and fungi have viruses as well that infect and cause disease. The first ever discovered virus affected the tobacco plant. And it's not just higher organisms, because single-celled organisms like amoeba, they get infected by viruses as well. And yes, even bacteria and archaea get infected by viruses. It is currently believed that every single living organism on this planet has at least one, and likely more than one, virus that can infect it, can make it sick, can kill it. So all cellular life is subject to viral infection. The viruses that infect bacteria, we often refer to them as bacteriophages. If you move on and go on and take microbiology too, you go to the lab and you start working with bacteriophages in the lab. Yes?
I wanted to ask if viruses are natural.
Are viruses natural?
Like, do you find them like where bacteria go?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a tough question, and is probably the subject of an entire course.